money flow like
The question is, if you decide to have a tenant in your property who is on benefits, how do you get that rent paid into your account so your property has low risk of a default in payment? Let's have a look. The first and best scenario, which is the one that we have at the moment, is that that tenant will agree to get that money paid into the landlord's account and not into his account, which then he needs to pay into your account. So it's a direct payment from the government, from the Department of Works and Pensions into your account as a landlord, which is a much better way to work. However, this has some downsides, but the process is the next one. The tenant, step one, will agree to direct that payment into your account, which is really good. What then needs to happen is that the tenant, who is hopefully on universal credit, because if the tenant is being on benefits for a very long time, you need to contact the council, but normally is the DWP that you need to contact. And there are two ways. One of them is that the tenant can do it, or should do it, is a lot easier. He should log into his journal account, in his universal credit account, and then put a request for a direct payment to the landlord. And the name for this payment is an MPTL, as you can see on the screen. And that means is a managed payment to landlord, MPTL. He will have to do that. Within that request, the tenant will have to enter your name as a landlord and the bank account where he wants the rent paid, which is your account as a landlord account, and also he will have to enter the total amount. Now, this process can also be started by you as a landlord if the tenant maybe doesn't want to do it or doesn't have the IT skills to do so. To do that, you need to go to the government portal, having all the information, and this makes it easier because in this scenario, the tenant agreed to do the payment, and then you can get other information like national insurance and anything you need to do the application. And the website that you would use to do the application is this one, which if you Google Universal Credit Landlord Request that you have here for a managed payment or rent arrears deduction, then you can start the whole process there. All you need to do is go through here, apply online for a direct rent payment or rent arrears deduction. Now, if we go back to our flow chart here in step 3, which is the DWP verification and setup, they will confirm the details. They will have a look at the tenancy agreement, which the tenant would have loaded as well, and set the MPTL. You would normally expect between 5 to 8 weeks initial delay in doing this. And obviously, with the times for the government, you normally would expect a slow response anyway. Now, there is something else here that you need to take into account. In this scenario that you can see here, tenant is in a room and he is paying £520 per month. But it's likely that the government with the local allowance won't be paying that much. And there is going to be a shortfall. In this case, for the Liverpool area, the shortfall is going to be around £175, which the tenant probably will have to pay himself. So you're going to end up with part of the rent paid by the tenant and part of the rent, most of the rent, paid by the council. And if you have a tenant in a self-contained studio, this amount could increase, at least in the area of Liverpool, to around £500 per month. But normally you need to talk to the tenant and make sure he understands that the part of the rent is going to be paid into the account, but they need to make up for the shortfall depending on the rent you are charging. If the rent you're charging is low, it might be that that's not the case, but just be aware that that can happen during the process. Now, the next important consideration to take into account is the payment timing, which is the universal credit pays in arrears and they pay when they finish the review. So not necessarily they're going to pay on the date that you want. So that's something important to take into account. So you organize your systems as well. But in a way, this is going to help you reduce the risk in your business because the government will pay on that date the rent for your tenant, most of it, hopefully. But as you can see, it might not be a perfect solution, but it's a better solution if you have a tenant who's willing to do that. Now, the scenario of a tenant who is in arrears and doesn't want to do this payment directly is as follows. Now, to be completely transparent, my experience with this second part is not being positive. And the reason is because you will use the portal or I showed before to apply for a direct payment, but the system is set up in a way that almost is set up in a way like landlords should fail to request this. And the reason I say that is because they will request for whether the tenant is in arrears or not. They will request the name and they will request the dates of the payments. And most of the time, they will send you an email saying, I'm sorry, we cannot help you because either this tenant is not receiving universal credit payments or this is the wrong information or any other response, which doesn't help. And you kind of find a wall there where you cannot continue. And it's a general email. You cannot really talk to them. You cannot really reply to them. So it's difficult. But having said that, I'll show you more or less how the process is so you can at least try. And if you are successful, send me a message because then we all can learn together this process. So the first thing to do to work on this scenario is that you need to make sure that your tenant is in arrears or that you consider that the tenant is vulnerable, like, for example, he or she has mental issues, or you consider that they need help with their finances. To that point, all good. But as I said, once you get to this point of the process, if the tenant is not in arrears, do not apply because they will reject it immediately. So make sure that when you go into the website, you know that the tenant is at least 2 months in arrears. Normally, the council is not to be contacted here because it's housing benefit only, but you need to contact the Department for Work and Pensions, and you need to apply through the website I showed you before. And it's not difficult to apply, but again, it's very vague and is set up for landlords to fail on doing this. Unfortunately, that's the way it's working at the moment. Then you will need to provide some information as to how the tenant is in arrears and the tenancy agreement. You then will have to wait for about 2 to 4 weeks to get the email I mentioned before, the one they tell you normally, we cannot help you because the tenant is not in our database, even though he might be, and they don't give you information on it. Best way to start that process is to talk to them and to the tenant and understand that he is getting universal credit information. And if you can get some other information like their reference number, maybe you can provide it and push for these kind of things. Because the other option is to take that tenant to court and spend £2,000 to £3,000 to get rid of that tenant who has decided not to pay, even though they are getting the money from the government. Hopefully, after 2 to 4 weeks, that gets approved and they start paying that rent into your bank account bear in mind about the shortfall that may happen depending on the local allowances in your area. And if fees rejected, I'd say try to reply with additional information and don't give up, because it's a very important part for your rental, for your property business. You're providing a good service, therefore you need to expect you're paid for that service, and your bank probably is expecting to be paid, and the electricity companies, the gas companies, they all expect to be paid. So in this case, you need to get paid as well, so your business continues. Now, something important to clarify here is that some years ago, many of the tenants or people who were in household benefits, they were paid by the council, the housing benefits, but then most of them have moved to the universal credit, and the payments are now being managed by the DWP. That's why you need to do the universal credit process. Now, just to finalize and to summarize, if you have a tenant who is not in arrears and agrees to do the direct payment, then you can do that with his or her help, and things are going to be much easier. If the tenant is at least 2 months in arrear, you don't need his or her consent to force the payment directly to yourself. However, once you manage to go through all the bureaucracy that this takes, if you get that payment, probably there's going to be a shortfall, and therefore you'll have to chase 2 payments, one from the government, another one from the tenant. So it's not an ideal solution, but it's a much better solution than having a tenant who cannot have or cannot manage his or her finances correctly, and therefore missing payments and falling into arrears for your rent. Hopefully that information is helpful. If you want to talk to me about managing properties in the Liverpool or Wirral area, please let me know at info@propertycashflow.co.uk, and I'll be happy to help. Also, if you want to invest in those areas, we are very much experts in those areas. We know the councils, we have the specific contacts necessary to create successful investment in those areas. So also contact us to info@propertycashflow.co.uk. My name is Noel Cardona, and see you in the next one. Thank you very much.